The United Nations Children's Fund has released the State of the World's Children report for 2019. That report says a third of children under the age of 5 are either malnutritioned or overweight, and that 2/3 are at risk of malnutrition because of poor diet. Let's get more on this report. I'm joined by James Elder. He's UNICEF Regional Chief of Communications for Eastern and Southern Africa. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News tonight. One of the highlights of that report is that 1 in 3 children around the world are not growing well.
Yeah, it's a really shocking number, and there's 2 parts to that malnutrition, that bad nutrition. And one is children just not getting enough food, not getting the right foods, but certainly not getting enough. And the other is something we're seeing increasingly, which is just children eating the wrong food, which is where we're seeing obesity, which is also malnutrition, bad nutrition. Unfortunately, the numbers you shared are even worse in the part of the world where we live, which is Eastern and Southern Africa, where about 1 in 8 children, the youngest children, that really critical time of growth, around 6 months to 24, 1 in 8 of them get the right foods and enough of them. And that matters greatly, because that matters to their development, that matters to how they perform in schools, and that matters to their future jobs and livelihoods.
Mm-hmm. Describe to us how the external food environment, personal food environment and food supply chain play a role in how children eat.
I think in 2 ways. I think if we look at those kids on the margins, those children whose families really struggle with affordability of food, then again, the climate crisis, climate change is very real. You know, leaders in rich countries may still be debating this, but those people who've done the least to impact the climate are suffering. So we see your program just there was talking about Beira. We see a cyclone in Mozambique. Then we see a drought in Namibia. Then we see a flood in Somalia, and we see a drought in Ethiopia. So the climate crisis is very real. At the other end of the spectrum, where we've seen a doubling of children becoming obese or overweight in the last 15 years, that's because too many companies are controlling processed food. So parents get very little choice. The marketing power of them is immense in terms of what the ability to advertise and so on. And so increasingly families with funds, with money, are buying foods that are high in calories and low in nutrition.
That report also says that by 2050, the population of Africa is going to double since 2017, reaching a total of about 2.5 billion people. So I want to juxtapose that with the fact that the World Bank says Africa may be home to as much as 90% of the world's poor people by 2030. How will that further impact the state of the child if that scenario comes to be?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. They talk about this thing called a demographic dividend or a demographic disaster. Demographics just being population change. And you're absolutely right that the population change happening right now across the continent is unprecedented. We've not seen it in human history. But whilst that can sound quite ominous, it is in fact gives the potential for sub-Saharan Africa, where still almost more than 2 in 3 people live on less than a couple of dollars, about 30 Rand a day. This population explosion gives Africa the chance to decrease poverty like never, ever before. If governments and the private sector, businesses have a big role here, if they invest in the right thing, which is in kids, we know that. If they invest in children up to the age of 3 or 4 in their right nutrition, and then they invest in schools and healthcare and, of course, skills, let's make sure our younger citizens have the right skills for the right jobs, then Africa will have, in fact, this great number of people at a working age. It'll be the envy of areas like Europe. So if that's possible, and you have this huge number of young people who are working and paying taxes and employed, then the continent will see this dividend, and you will see a reduction in poverty that is a once-in-history chance. And that's what governments have to aim towards, and that's what they need to act towards and spend towards now, because that demographic window will close. And if it closes, then you have the flip side, which is this disaster, which is what you're referring to, whereby you'll increase poverty, you'll increase unemployment, and all the things that go with unemployment and poverty, insecurity, and so on. So it's a historic moment. It's not some far-off moment. It's like the climate crisis. This is the moment for the private sector, whom jobs are very important to, and for governments to really act and to give young people and children every opportunity to be those contributing members of society that they want to be.
Mm-hmm. I know you've proposed some solutions now. You've also, as UNICEF, spoken about that multifaceted approach to end hunger, using systems. Can you just get a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, One of the rich and poor divide is very real, but for example, exclusive breastfeeding, and what UNICEF means by that is that mums, only breastfeed their children from 0 to 6 months. Exclusive breastfeeding, it doesn't matter if you're rich and poor, every mum has the chance to give her child that incredibly nutritious food. Now, going beyond that, after 6 months, it's important to keep breastfeeding, but adding in foods and so on. Now, for example, governments have a role there to try and make sure women get maternity leave. Private sector has a role to make sure that working mums have somewhere to breastfeed, have somewhere to express milk. So breastfeeding is just one way where those two parts can come together. Equally, governments have a role when UNICEF says if your child gets sick, get to a health centre, get help, and get micronutrients to really boost its nutrition. But when a family does that in rural parts of South Africa or Malawi or Kenya, where I am, and there are no micronutrients, then everyone's been let down. So there are certain things that can be done in that capacity, that small things that make a huge difference to mums and dads who are doing everything they can around the clock to make sure their kids get the nutrition they need.
Let's talk about small things that perhaps parents watching this program can do to prevent the kind of too much food that's not good for their kids. What kind of behavioural changes need to be implemented, and what steps should be put in place to ensure that kids on the other side who can afford food are eating healthy, nutritious food that isn't to their detriment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're talking to a dad of teenage kids who fall for marketing and would like the junk food, and it's very, very high in sugar content too. So, let's not pretend that companies don't know what they're doing. Sugar is a drug, and it's one that children highly appeal to. So there's a big responsibility there on the private sector to make sure, for example, foods are properly marketed, foods are properly labelled. We've all been in supermarkets and bought a cereal only to discover later it's like eating a chocolate bar for breakfast. So those things can be done, and sugar taxes are proven by governments to work. When it comes to mums and dads, I think it's about having that nutrition conversation, which I can see, your young viewers rolling their eyes. But the fact is, if you want to look good, if you want to feel good, if you want to operate off minimal sleep, if you want to study well, if you want to play sport well, if you want to go 1,000,000 miles an hour like a lot of young people do, you need that nutrition. That idea that food is the fuel for your body is very real. But equally, excessive sugar just slows you down, and of course also means you add weight. So I think the more parents can have that conversation, like many conversations, of just having an open chat to your kids, but showing them the right nutrition in the house. Spending that time to cook a little bit. It does take longer to cook, for sure. Spending that time to cook, sit down as a family, have a chat, make the family meal an important part of time. Don't sit in front of the telly. All those things, I think, let kids understand that, eating well and eating as a family, eating nutritious food is a big part of, day-to-day life for us.
Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. James Elder, UNICEF Regional Chief of Communications for Eastern and Southern Africa, joining us via Skype there.